Virginia.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here today. I hope that by now no one is suffering from conference weariness. Please hang in there. I'll try to be as, well, least boring as possible. My brief is to cover political activism in the African context. I'm sure you'll agree that Africa is a rather large area of the world, so I'll try to limit my remarks to some key case studies. If we consider the events of the past 2 or 3 years, it may appear that some of the unrest and political mobilization associated with the Arab uprisings had spread to some West African countries. And for this reason, West Africa is the area I'd like to focus on today. Traditionally, and with a few exceptions, coup d'etat rather than political activism have been the driving force of change in sub-Saharan Africa. Think, for instance, at the recent cases in Mali and Guinea-Bissau, which makes it even more interesting to look closely at what has been happening in places such as Burkina Faso and Senegal, where protests demanding greater equality, government transparency, and defense of democratic values were staged in all main cities. Or Guinea, the set of fully fledged riots causing the economy significant damage. And Nigeria, which has seen nationwide strikes and international protests under the banner of Occupy Nigeria. But what is behind this political activism? Can we really talk of an Africa Spring? And are these movements mature enough to have geopolitical effects? And by this, I mean that domestic developments begin to matter to those outside the continent. And if this is the case, how significant can we expect these effects to be? So these are the questions that I'll try to unpack over the next 10 minutes or so. When protests erupted in 2011, officials in Burkina Faso started to worry that the events in Egypt and Tunisia would provide inspiration for Burkinabe protesters. Students took the streets to protest against ever-increasing food prices, the disconnect with the political elite, the corrupt bureaucracy, the opaque judicial system, and the often brutal police. Meanwhile, the army staged a series of mutinies throughout 2011 to protest against poor living conditions and unpaid allowances. So during the 3-month crisis, everybody in turn took the streets, from peasants to lawyers, from cotton growers to shop owners, everybody. President Compaoré, who has been serving since 1987 as head of a semi-authoritarian regime which he fully controls, curbed the protests, appointed a new minister and an army chief of staff, and made a few concessions. However, the ruling party has continued to operate with little transparency, and in February 2012, new protests broke out, this time to complain against poor road infrastructure, and also some student protests took place. So while the security situation seems to have improved, protests have continued this summer, and it remains unclear whether the causes of the unrest have been truly addressed. And there is fear that more is to come, especially with the 2015 elections looming. And attempts to amend the constitution to allow the president to run for his 5th term are likely to result in additional protests. So you might wonder at this point why I'm dwelling so much on a country which arguably has very little geopolitical weight. Well, while Burkina Faso is certainly not thought of as an obvious foreign investment destination, although the gold mining sector has been slowly expanding since the late 2000s, or a significant player in the global arena, the country and its president have indeed amassed considerable diplomatic weight. The president has in fact secured himself an almost indispensable role as a mediator in regional crises, especially in Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, and Guinea. And last year, he mediated talks with Mali's coup leaders. Therefore, protracted internal instability might actually limit Burkina's regional role and could deprive Western partners, such as the US and France, of a strategic ally in dealing with regional crises. But let's move to the next example, Senegal. Well, Senegal is the only West African country that has not witnessed a coup or a civil war since independence. Yet, its democratically elected leaders have been quasi-autocratic, and the country has seen pro-democracy protests taking place on and off for a few years, especially since the late 2000s, when people really started demanding greater political participation. So in the summer of 2011, President Wade proposed constitutional amendments allowing presidential candidates to win the election with only 25% of the votes. And he also sought to establish a president-vice president ticket, allegedly in order to run with his son Karim. So these proposals were met by popular oppositions, and riots began on the 23rd of June 2011, giving rise to the M23 movement. The M23 became a wider democratization movement, bringing together the youth, various civil societies, political factions, and is now the driving force behind most Senegalese protests. And beside contesting the president's candidacy, M23 voiced the popular discontent towards rising unemployment, corruption, nepotism, rising prices, and outlandish spending projects. So this massive popular mobilization achieved its original goal, and the president retracted his proposal regarding constitutional amendments. Many went as far as saying that the M23 movement had effectively saved the constitution. We know, however, that the Senegalese political scene is not panacea. Wade did run for a third term, and even though he lost the election of his former protégé, Saki Mal, in March last year, meant that the country remains in a quasi-authoritarian state with little done in terms of innovative socio-political and economic policies. In recent years, international eyes have turned to the often forgotten country of Guinea-Conakry. The reason is simple. Guinea is the world's #1 exporter of aluminum or bauxite and has the planet's largest iron ore deposit. However, politically, Guinea remains a highly volatile country, as confirmed by the events of the past 2 years. It all began in March 2012, with thousands of protesters demonstrating against the government for failing to organize credible elections, soon followed by thousands rallying in support of the ruling party. More opposition rallies hit the capital in the summer, and they were met by tear gas, and dozens of people were arrested. This prompted the opposition parties to withdraw from all government institutions, and all of this was taking place in a context of very deep ethnic tensions. The appointment of a very controversial electoral commission fueled even more protests, and by early 2013, demonstration had spread across the whole country. And when the President Condé, failed to call for elections, those protests turned into riots. As of today, over 20 people have died and hundreds have been injured as a result of this protest. Elections have been scheduled for the 24th of September this year, so only a couple of days away. And luckily this morning I checked the news because last night they'd been postponed once again. So the new announced date is the 28th of September. I'm not holding my breath. Guinea's continuing political uncertainty has damaged its economy and its economic potential. Economic growth forecast has been slashed to 2.9% for this year, down from 4.5% because of the protests and because of political paralysis. Mining companies, BHP, Billiton, and Rusal, have divested some bauxite and iron ore interests or suspended operations for sovereign risk and other reasons. Work at this Simandou mine, the world's largest iron ore deposit, and due to start production in 2015, has all but stalled, with Brazilian mining firm Vale expressing concerns about corruption and Rio Tinto reportedly withdrawing 90% of its staff this year. But let me now turn to my final case study, and that's Nigeria, a key African player. On the 1st of January 2012, President Jonathan announced the removal of fuel subsidy. The next day, week-long strikes began across the country, led by the main trade unions. The Occupy Nigeria movement was born and immediately went viral on all social media, on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, the BlackBerry messengers. And strikes brought Nigeria to a standstill, with protesters closing down Abuja airport, blocking roads, closing down public offices, and with oil and gas worker trade unions threatening to shut down all production. Tear gas and sometimes fatal beatings were used by the police to disperse thousands of protesters. So similar protests under the banner of Occupy Nigeria also took place at the Nigeria High Commission in London, at the embassies in Brussels and in South Africa as well, at the IMF in Washington, all highlighting the role that diaspora can play in fostering political activism and also pushing demands even from afar. So these 6-day strikes, estimated to have cost the economy $600 million US a day, only came to an end on the 16th of January when the president agreed to an immediate 30% reduction of fuel prices. But was this all about fuel prices? I believe that last year's events have greater significance and are also indicative of the level of mistrust and disconnect between the federal government and the population. 2012 saw the largest protest in years, and the question of subsidies, whose process most citizens probably do not fully understand, acted as a unifying cause, bringing together citizens from across the nation, regardless of their ethnicity or religion, to demand government accountability, perhaps also inspired by the events of the Arab Spring. President Jonathan, on his part, could not have chosen a worse time to introduce such unpopular measures, at a time when most people had lost faith in his ability to govern and also to protect the country from the northern insurgency. Really, this was a very bad time. But let's finally draw some conclusions. So the case studies I discussed today, Burkina Faso and the seemingly geopolitically irrelevant country which holds significant diplomatic weight, Senegal with its formalized M23 movement, Guinea with its enormous economic potential, and Nigeria and its international Occupy Nigeria movement, all have seen forms of political activism with different drivers, different manifestations, different outcomes. But how significant are the geopolitical effects of political activism in West Africa? Well, perhaps not that significant if we compare them to the Arab Spring-related events. But why? For one, while the events of the Arab world have received great media coverage, the same cannot be said about the events in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, I guess that some of you may not have heard before of the examples I've mentioned today. The other media-related aspect to be considered is that while the African continent has indeed witnessed a mobile phone revolution in the past decade, internet penetration is still pretty low, at about 10% in the average sub-Saharan country. Text messaging is well developed through 2G networks, and by definition, this provides a mobile tool to enable would-be protesters, but is also susceptible to blackouts. And radio, easily controlled by governments, remains the prime tool for spreading information. So most African protests do not yet benefit from the mobilizing power of social media in the way that the Tahrir Square protesters did. One other aspect to explore is the one of urbanization. Political activism, mass mobilization, and resulting protests are typical of urban areas. And while more and more people from sub-Saharan Africa are moving into towns and cities, urbanization is still low, with only 37% of sub-Saharan Africans living in urban areas. And here I would like to add a word of caution. Comparison should not be overdone. Differences between North Africa and the rest of Africa are very significant, and difference among sub-Saharan African countries are also very deep. Nevertheless, I think it's also legitimate to look at sub-Saharan Africa's high unemployment rates, unmet expectations among a bulging youth population, rising living costs, feeling of disenfranchisement, often unresponsive leaders, and ask ourselves why more protests haven't taken place and whether more should be expected in the coming years. Some have argued that in some cases, West African and sub-Saharan African countries more generally lack strong trade unions or strong enough religious institutions, parties, or other forms of strong intermediary groupings between the state and the individual able to mass mobilize the population. And this was particularly clear in the case of Burkina Faso. Others would say that the strong ethnic divide prevents the emergence of effective movements. Another explanation brings this down to elite cooptation. In other words, protest leaders are easily co-opted by the political elite leading the movements.
Can I ask you to conclude, because otherwise there won't be time for your
Sure.
two colleagues.
So all of this to say that I think even though the movements in West Africa may not have had the same impact of the Arab Spring, they should not be dismissed, and they have the opportunity to influence similar movements, copycat movements across Africa. And they also influence what, or they're part of the whole discourse we mentioned earlier about people's power and the diversity of strategic actors that continues to grow across the world. Thank you.